Hola a todas las señoras, non-señoras, and everyone in between. This is Gabby.
This is Sophia.
This is Sonia.
We are Señora Power, and if your reaction to that is que, check out episode 1 to catch up on who we are and what we're up to. Today we're bringing you the first part of establishment señoras, those señoras who bucked up against institutions like the church, the police, and schools time and time again, but somehow always came back to them. This episode is about Lupe Anguiano, a señora who started out as a teenage party girl, went to the convent, and left to help the Mexican-American community and women on welfare. Señora Anguiano has lived so many remarkable lives in one, but we'll be starting off her story with that time she had to stand up to the LAPD. The bulk of our information comes from the newly published biography of Lupe Anguiano titled Uncompromised, written by Debora Wright and edited by Sarah Ann Fox. Much of our information also comes from the 2011 oral history that Virginia Espino did of Señora Anguiano, housed in the UCLA Center for Oral History Research. Just so you know, we'll be talking about police violence, intimate partner violence, and suicidal ideation in this episode, so if that's not good for where you are right now in life, then we'll see you another time. Otherwise, vámonos al mundo de Señora Power. There was a festive air about the day, or at least excitement, as a group of teen boys in East Los Angeles gathered at Cleveland House, a Latino social service agency with sports facilities. This was the mid-1960s, and tensions between gangs were starting to be made worse by police interference in Los Angeles. Lupe Anguiano looked on as the event she had been anticipating began with a cheery start, a boxing match between teenage boys from two rival gangs in Los Angeles. Lupe and her colleagues at the Teen Post program, David Lizarraga and Bob Bewley, had organized a controlled event where the boys in their organization could confront each other and air out their anger. Suddenly, cops with batons stormed in, hitting and beating the young boys, and even Lupe as she stood up to one of these police officers to prevent him from beating the teens. It wasn't the first time they'd had issues. Lupe says, "Our complaints against police brutality were very well known. The community's effort to work against police brutality. You had some of these policemen coming in, and if your face was brown and you were out in the park and seemed like you were just roaming around doing nothing, they were just very watchful." For some background, Lupe Anguiano helped found the Teen Post program in the early 1960s when she was still a religious sister. She eventually left the nunhood, but her program designed to get teenagers off the street in East Los Angeles flourished until the end of the 1960s. The Teen Post program was where Lupe got her start in Mexican-American community organizing. She felt strongly that Mexican-Americans were being neglected and that the answer was to have equal educational opportunities and support to boost their self-confidence. A child of Mexican immigrants who were farm workers in the 1920s and 40s, Lupe understood the kinds of unequal conditions that Mexican-Americans faced in this country, specifically in the Inland Empire of California. I'll pause here to ask you both, what do you think about Lupe's struggle so far? Is there any way in which you identify with her efforts? I mean, do you at all? Like, you can say you don't identify, and that's valid too.
I'm not sure how much I identify specifically with her nunhood, but I think that the teenagers hanging out in the park narrative feels familiar, even maybe like contemporary. And I think that her program, Teen Post, is a lot like maybe what we would consider like the Boys and Girls Club now, which is like pretty popular, right? It's just a way of getting young people involved in an activity that is not like quote unquote on the streets.
But I think it's also very cool how she recognized this need for people to let out their anger, right? Like there's a recognition that there is a certain kind of injustice going on, that people are angry and that they need healthy avenues to release that kind of anger, to work through it, to navigate it. So that also feels very prescient right now. Like we still need those kinds of programs for people.
Yeah, I mean, Lupe herself says that a lot of this was thought up by her collaborators, David Lizarraga and Bob Bewley. But she was very much kind of the head of that organization, or one of the top people, and she thought it was a great idea. She also said that before the event, she had coordinated with the police, the local police, to make sure that they knew this was happening, so they knew, and to make sure that they knew that it wasn't a violent event, that they were just getting the kids together to do an after-school thing. And so it was, yes, and yet, and I think she says that she felt a little bit betrayed there, but she also says that she relied on the police a lot during her time organizing this Teen Post program, because she alluded to the fact that, you know, drugs were a very difficult topic, and she said she didn't feel comfortable dealing with like drugs, by which I understand from what she says that she's talking about like drug dealing, or like even like the commerce of drugs on the streets, which is just such a difficult topic, especially in LA. And I think that at this moment, when she was starting the Teen Post program in the 60s, it was still something that was very unfamiliar for even community organizers, for people who considered themselves like advocates for the community, right? So that's, she did say that she relied on the police for that, and that she kept doing that even after this incident, but that she did feel very confused and betrayed, because it was something that she didn't expect, and that she was very upset that happened.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, actually, to, like, set up a boxing match at all. Like, a nun to set up a boxing match. And then to have it be between rival gangs, it feels like a West Side Story, like, fanfic. I kind of love it. Like, that's the avenue that she took. But it obviously really sucks the way it ended. I think police brutality is something that's really on our minds right now as a nation.
And I guess it wasn't only about the organization of it, right? Because sure, it's one thing, it's a dangerous thing to be working with like rival gangs at this moment in time. It's also a dangerous thing to seek help from this particular institution, with its long history of violence towards people of color, especially Latino and Black people, or males especially.
I mean, that she even said herself, from that quote we heard, that they had like issues with the police in general. And like, you can imagine if you're advocating for young men of color, especially like in a city like LA, you will come up against violence and conflict with the police. I think this also points to segregation and the effects of segregation on communities. Like, she talked herself a lot, and we'll like get to that in a bit, but she talked herself about how she felt that this kind of segregation and discrimination undermined people's self-confidence and their self-image, and that in the end kept them from getting the kind of jobs or the kind of like life that they deserved. She talked a lot about like self-confidence, or she talks a lot about self-confidence, self-image, and dignity. And I did want to say, like, you know, y'all mentioned like she was being pulled between like, you know, this Teen Post stuff and like the police, but she was also being kind of pulled in the third direction by the church, because she was a nun when she was doing this program. And that's that was, I think, for her a very like difficult tightrope to walk.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about how much the church was willing to work with gang members or people who were involved in drug dealing, if they saw what Lupe saw, you know, an opportunity to help the community by working with them and not just trying to ostracize them or, you know, deal a judgment in some way.
Definitely sounds like Lupe is having to balance and navigate different kinds of establishments and institutions. So would love to hear more about Señora Lupe.
Yeah, that's a great moment to talk about her biographical information a little bit. So Lupe Anguiano was born in Denver, Colorado, after her parents moved there fleeing the consequences of the Mexican Revolution. Just to locate you all in time, this is around the 1920s. Her father was Huichol, indigenous in Mexico, and her mother was the daughter of Spaniards. Their marriage was not welcomed by either family, but in the end, Lupe's mother, Rosario Gonzalez, inherited her father's dry goods store and his lands. The couple lived off of this while they had Lupe's oldest sibling, Andy. Then they moved to Denver after the Mexican Revolutionary government seized their lands. Lupe grew up in Denver until her preteen years when her family moved to Saticoy, California to be with their extended family on Lupe's mother's side. It was towards the end of high school that Lupe began to think about what she wanted to do with her future. And she writes in a 1959 op-ed of a convent magazine titled The Missionary Catechist. She says, quote, "A missionary's great privilege is to bring the good news of the gospel to the poor, to help them rise up and face the world with dignity. Yes, a missionary was what I wished to be." She struggled to convince her family that she was serious about this vocation because her family saw her as a lively young person who had many boyfriends and was always happy to go out with their friends. Despite this, Lupe went to the Missionary Sisters Convent in Victoria Hall, Huntington, Indiana in 1948 to begin her journey as an aspirant. So that's the first level of nunhood when you first go to the convent. Throughout her career as a nun, Lupe interpreted missionary work as outreach and aid. She would write op-ed articles under her birth name, trying to separate these opinions from her religious persona due to the backlash she received from higher-ups who thought she was becoming too, quote, worldly. And just to make this distinction, when a person enters the religious life, usually they ask you to choose a religious name, like another different name. And so Lupe was not Lupe at the convent, but she wrote under her birth name, Guadalupe Anguiano, to write her op-eds. Lupe writes, speaking about discrimination towards Mexican Americans in East LA, she says, "We cripple a people and then complain because they limp. This thought keeps coming to my mind every time I read or hear such accusations." And just to frame this, at the time that she wrote this, I think that word, cripple, was something that people used a lot. But we understand now that this is actually a discriminatory word, and it does not get used outside of the community. So she was specifically addressing in this quote the racist belief that Mexican Americans were lazy. This is such a rich background for a señora who wanted to break free from the constraints of an institution that wasn't letting her help others. So like the church at the time was nervous about her becoming so close with the people she was helping. At the same time, she had a lot of respect for the church and that institution. And she felt that calling to join the church when she was a teenager. And she stayed there for many, many years. Like, she went in at her first level of nunhood in 1948. And she didn't leave the religious life until like mid-70s, 1975 or so. I just wanted to ask you both what you think of this really brief recounting of her life until her advocacy.
Well, one, I always think it's funny when her parents are like, "Nah, you're not gonna do this." And like, she sticks with it for so long, as you were just saying. But like, when we were at the UCLA Chicano Studies Archives, there's a lot of that. I feel like a lot of like livelihood there. Wait, we didn't look at hers. Oh, I'm thinking of this in Teen Post. Because there's a lot of, like, photos, right, of, like, men who are, like, pledging their love to her. But she felt such a call, like, a religious call to, like, join the nunnery and serve God, which I think goes back to, like, a spiritual conversation we've been having for a while, which is this idea of wanting to do justice and wanting to do good through the institution of the church. Which, as you're pointing out, is really complex and difficult, actually.
I think that the church sets up this like division of like us versus them kind of thing, us Christians versus them, the non-Christian people and everything. But even despite this division that is so present sometimes in church life and like in nunhood specifically, right? Like people within the convent, people outside of the convent and everything. It's super interesting to hear how Lupe continues to be concerned with like external issues. She continues to write. I mean, she's writing in Catholic magazines and stuff like that, but she is definitely aware of this external sense of injustice, and she's also aware of the church as a resource perhaps for those injustices. I mean, it sounds like she's super aware of what she can do in her position as a nun to sort of help in these external issues.
Well, yeah, and also when she talks about going to the convent, there was only one other aspirant or even like woman there who was like Latina. And so Lupe said like kind of like even though they didn't really have things in common, like they became really close friends. And I think like, you know, Lupe didn't say this, but I think it was this idea of how do we survive now in this only kind of white, very rigid space after having lived in like Mexican communities, like segregated communities all our lives until now, when she was in her training of being a nun. During that time, like during part of that time, she had to stay at Victory Hall in Huntington, Indiana, and her mail was gone through by like the head sister. She found out later that this head nun like straight up threw away like letters from her ex-boyfriend, from her friends who were telling her, we'll send you money if you want to leave. Even her siblings were like, we'll send you money if you want to leave. Everyone was like, why are you doing this?
Blink if you want help.
Yeah. And she like really had this conviction that that's where she had to be. And so that's why I'm so curious about Señora Anguiano, because she has this feeling that this is her calling, and at the same time, like, you know, her quote unquote superiors in like the convent and everything, they seem to like her, but they also are like, I feel like you're being too attached. Her first 2 assignments, she was removed from them because she was becoming too attached.
What does that even like mean? I feel like
I don't know.
like what? I guess it goes back to the worldliness. Like they felt she was too attached to not the idea of like God and like the institution of the church, and she was getting too close with people that she, I guess, like what is the ideal nun, you know, helping from a distance?
I mean, that's also something that was very puzzling to me when I was reading it, because she was in the order of missionary sisters. So by the definition of the church, that means that those individuals go out into the community. And yes, like there is obviously the very big looming aspect of the fact that you're supposed to like either convert people, or you're supposed to like, I don't know, make them more like loving towards God or something. But there's also the idea, like for a really long time, missionaries have been very violent and have also been like resources for their communities. Not necessarily like, you know, can those communities come up with their own resources if given the chance? Probably. But in a lot of historical instances, they are maybe like the link to education. They're maybe like the link to like securing jobs. Yeah, federal resources, stuff like that. So it's just such a catch-22, I think. And I think that it's important because not only this señora, but other señoras we're looking at have this calling or this like inclination towards things like missionary work. And I think that I personally read it as a desire to right the wrongs that they see around them in a way that they know how. And for Lupe, it was very clear. I mean, she says that she loves working with young people. And she also said that she had always seen kind of how things were. I mean, being a agricultural worker since she was a child, like, I mean, this is something I'm sure that stuck with her. She says herself that she doesn't have trauma from it and that it was like just a thing that her family did. So that is something to keep in mind. But I think that it is also a fact that agricultural workers then and now are treated in very unjust ways. And also it is a fact that Lupe participated in and supported the United Farm Workers movement. So, you know, I think that all of this is kind of in character. This is what we're talking about. She sees injustices. She wants to help. She wants to gain resources for the community. And also she wants to be part of institutions because she feels that this is the way to affect change.
And I feel like as we had mentioned in our other church episodes, but at this moment in time, the workforce, the labor force, any opportunities for women were, you know, like emerging and were becoming more popular, but they were still pretty scant. So there were only certain things women can do to help their communities and to gather resources for their communities. And the church was one of them. And, you know, you gotta make do with what you have, right?
Totally. I think also we've talked about this in other episodes, but like looking at that really great quote that you gave us from her Convent Magazine article, if you isolate like the phrase to help them rise up and face the world with dignity, that was like one of her 3 goals that she thought a missionary was able to do. When we talk about like rising up in dignity there, the church being religious and being seen as like a God-fearing person does lend you some respectability in the eyes of many societies. Obviously, like there's the Catholic versus Protestant thing that's like looming in the background of these conversations. But if somebody was struggling in life like these farm workers, this is like one way that you could access dignity.
And I also want to highlight too that after she left the convent, she was still Catholic. She has said her whole life that she is very Catholic and that she still believes very much in God. And her official stance is, you know, I left because I had some stuff I wanted to do, and it was no longer something that I needed to do as a nun, right? But she's always very Catholic. That was not the reason for her leaving convent. But I did want to take the moment to talk about like respect versus respectability. Lupe, you know, had this drive to be able to become a respectable person in her community in order to bring respect to the community that she was like advocating for. Her big thing, you know, talking about dignity, Sonia, like you were saying, part of that dignity is garnering respect, and that especially working with teen boys or teens who were in like a gang life, there's this idea of respect. Like respect gets used in various connotations. Like there's the idea of you need to make people respect you. That's a violent idea, I think, in a lot of like gang circles. But then there's also this idea of what does it look like to have your inherent dignity recognized. She was coming from a background of like being enraged that Mexican American youths did not have the same access to education. So they were not being given the same respect. Her using her respectability in order to get respect for her community was something that we definitely see here.
No, that's super helpful. There's like respect in an authority way. Like you have the respect of the police because you come off as like a good citizen who doesn't do illegal things, who's like, you know, respectful of laws. But then there's the respect that's more in line with like a dense dignity, like something that acknowledges that you're a human being or you're a living being that has desires and resources or needs access to resources for basic needs, but also like a future. And the idea of a future was not guaranteed for many of these people that she's working with, from the farm workers to the youth. So that's really helpful, I think, to pull apart respect to respectability.
Yeah, especially in this episode about what is it called?
Establishment Señoras.
Establishment Señoras.
Especially in this episode about establishment Señoras, because for me, the difference between respect and respectability is who is doing the action a lot of the times, right? So respect is something that you can give to other people, right? Something that demands respect, etc. But respectability is kind of like somewhat like kind of like an imposed position, right? Like, especially when we think about the history of people of color trying to attain respectability and present themselves as people who are worthy of respect. So I think that institutions and establishments have a very big role in creating our ideas of respectability. And just going back to something that you said earlier, Gabby, but Señora Lupe leaves convent life because she has things to do outside of being a nun, right? Or like not as a nun. So, I mean, what does that even mean for her to go into the convent looking for that kind of respectability that nunhood affords, and then leaving the convent perhaps as a kind of señora, a respectable kind of señora, and, you know, using that institutional status to continue with her work outside of that contained place. Yeah.
Just to add one more thing too to this idea of respectability, it is a term that Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, I had to make sure to look that up to get it right. She coined the politics of respectability in 1993, and she's talking specifically about Black women in the Baptist Church from the 18th century to the 20th century. 19th century to 20th century. And she talks about also how the church becomes a method of resisting racism and dehumanization, which is, I think, something that we're talking about as well.
Yeah, I think it's also like really interesting that the original use of respectability has, like, the original reason why this term was coined by this academic person has to do with church and gender, and race, has to do with what options these women had to gain resources for their communities, right? And a lot of the times we keep coming back to the church. It also gives them a way, like a standing, a power in their community to be able to advocate for certain things. But then we can also think about what limitations that gives you. Like if you're using the vocabulary and the hierarchy of this institution, then you're also kind of like accountable, like have to take in also the limits of that institution.
Which she seemed to be wrestling with, right? Like, I think that's maybe why we're drawn to her. I think you said this earlier, Gabby, but like, she seems to recognize the limitations because she butted up against them like time and time again. And just the church's like real inability to see, honestly, to like see color. Like that feels like what it boils down to in many ways.
Yes.
Is they're like, well, we're helping all poor people. And she's like, okay, but there's some people like Mexican immigrant farm workers who like need particular resources.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And I think that individuals like Lupe maybe were trying to make change happen. But as we see in Lupe's specific case, like she had to just be like, actually, I need to leave. Like, and it was something I think that was very hurtful for her too. Although I know she speaks very highly of like her time in the convent. But yeah, but anyway, like I think that all of these things point to the obstacles that Lupe went through to gain resources for her community, and also the way that she saw her community in various different actual geographical locations, right? Because she was moved from place to place. We're looking specifically at the East LA period of her life, but she actually ended up setting up the organization that she's famous for in San Antonio. She always liked to work, you know, with people, women specifically of Mexican descent, but she worked with a lot of different communities, and I guess she always made her community in wherever she was, and that's something that people that she helped, like they wrote testimonials saying things like that, that they felt her attention specifically. Yeah.
And it goes back to the sort of colorblindness of the church that we were mentioning earlier too, right? Because, you know, if the church is all about like human dignity, I mean, in many ways the Chicano movement was also about specifically Mexican American dignity, right? Like it was about respectability, really. So you would think that they would have similar goals, and yet they're non-compatible. And it's so interesting how Lupe had to be like, you know, you cannot take a picture of me right here. No one can know I'm here. I'm still supporting you, but like, don't let anyone know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was semi-secret, right? I think she talks a little bit about this, where obviously her superiors in the church knew what she was doing. But I think that as soon as it became too public, or as soon as it was too much under her name, then it would become a problem. Which also feels difficult to understand, right? Because it's like, do you care if she's actually too worldly, or do you care if it reflects a certain way? And I mean, that's my opinion. That's not what Lupe says. So the Teen Post program, you could say that Lupe helped found it, and then maintain it. And this was maybe the start of a lot of her formal activism. Before then, she was, like I said, she was definitely very much pro-education. She was an educator herself. Lupe founded this space to help people in what we would now call the nonprofit sector. So I think that that's kind of where she found a place for herself to be able to act. And then later on in her career, when she founded her own organization, she actually became famous for starting the National Women's Employment Organization. She incorporated it as her, I guess, LLC, but it was a nonprofit. So I guess I want to, near the end, ask you both, what kind of specific resource gathering do you see in Lupe's East LA years that we've talked about?
I think just going off of this last conversation about the Teen Post program, affirmation or validation is a resource that she's gathering for the community in multiple ways, right? Just affirming that, yes, it's okay to feel angry, and you want to hit someone about it, let's organize a boxing match or whatever, and taking those feelings seriously, I see where you're coming from, I'm gonna do something about it. That's the kind of resource gathering that I'm seeing here.
Mm-hmm. Along with that, and you pointed out, but the space, I think physical, a building, a physical space to be in and to be given this affirmation that Sophia just said, this source of dignity, not in a park, right? Which has all these coded narratives for young people. And I think also it's really interesting because I think we're focused on women a lot in this podcast, which is something that we are doing intentionally. But here we have a focus on boys. And I think that that's really interesting and something to sit with for a second, of the way that young men of color are treated as threats, are treated as inherently criminal, or if not already a criminal, then bound to be one. And so I think a resource is giving them a space in which that is not the case.
I agree, Sonia. I think that's definitely in line with what Señora Lupe would say, especially of that time, is giving the space for people to feel validated and to feel human in a environment where that dehumanizes them constantly is something that's priceless.
Yeah, this is a good point. To be given a space to hang out and be a a young person, right? Be a kid in whatever way you want, right? Just be you in this safe space, hanging out with your friends and getting ready for the boxing match. I don't know, I'm stuck on this boxing match thing. I think it's cool. I thought it was cool.
Yeah, you like the boxing match.
Yeah, Sophia wants to box. She wants to fight everyone, just so you know.
I am also angry. I want a Señora to organize a boxing match for me in a safe space.
I think of organizations and advocacy work and outreach work in the 60s as being somewhat tainted by a lot of institutional racism. Lupe's story shows us that it is never out of date to have someone from that community advocating for their community, despite all of the conflicting things that they have to deal with. I think that this is such a real way of participating in community organization. And I think that for me, I identify a lot with the idea of feeling conflicted as a community organizer. What are you going to do for the people who are counting on you what's the best way to make sure that they're happy and healthy and like thriving. It's a hard question to answer when you have to confront the realities of institutional pressures. Well, I think that it's very clear that Señora Lupe gained a lot of resources for her community. She fought against institutions at times. She also benefited from institutions at times, the same ones that were conflicting for her. I think that her case is something very valuable because of its complexity to understanding how these women throughout the 20th century were able to gain resources for their community, were able to gain respect for their community in this way that didn't necessarily come easily. That also meant compromise a lot of the times. That also meant accountability to other people for something that might not have been completely faultless, right? But in the end, I think that, especially talking about Lupe, you can see her impact in all of the people who have written saying that if it weren't for her, then they would not have the life that they wanted to have. So I think that is something that no one can take away. It's very valuable. And this is actually just one example of Señora power. We'll be talking about many more in the episodes to come. Lupe isn't the only señora who was an institutional activist, so stick around for the conversation about Lupe and Mamie Garcia, another señora in Houston. We love to put these señoras in conversation, even if they did not converse IRL. So, actively avoid, no. But yeah, stick around for more señora content, and we'd love to hear from you all if you are interested in that. This is us signing off. Bye.